So India is also sending out a message of strong defense modernization, and the focus remains on Atmanirbhar Bharat. But before I get you more on this, we have a fine panel of experts on China. I have Anant Krishnan, former India Today's Beijing correspondent, currently with The Hindu. Anant Krishnan will get us more details and perspective on China's defense budget. Also with me is Professor Brahma Chilani, who keeps a hawk eye on China, and of course Lieutenant General Rakesh Sharma. He's a distinguished fellow at the Center for Land Warfare Studies, commanded the Leh Corps. Before I come to our guests to make sense of what the Chinese defense budget means for India, for Taiwan, for Japan, for democracies in the region, let's take a look at this report.
Weeks after Chinese soldiers pulled back from the south bank of Pangong Tso in Ladakh, and amidst continuing standoff in Depsang, Gogra hot springs, and spiraling tension with Taiwan and Japan in South and the East China Sea, China's defense budget for the first time has crossed the $200 billion mark. This is the biggest increase in the Chinese defense budget in the past 2 years, as China has systematically moved forward to realize its dream of being the most powerful nation by 2050. Chinese President Xi Jinping, who also heads the all-powerful Central Military Commission, has vowed to make China the greatest military power with complete military modernization by 2035. China aims to dominate across all theaters of war by 2050.
中国在2007年参加了联合国军费透明制度。
China's military budget at $209 billion is 4 times that of India at $49.5 billion. The US is the world's largest military spender with a budget of $740 billion annually.
China's growing military challenges, be it from the US or more recently from India, where the Indian forces challenged the Chinese army, could have prompted this increase in their defense budget, which has crossed $200 billion. China is looking at fully transforming its army by 2027, and by 2050 it aims to match the US military.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang announced the defense budget, claiming China had achieved its aims in 2020. China has also announced a 40% salary hike to attract talent in its armed forces. The Chinese Navy is expected to get the biggest chunk of the defense budget, with China launching its 3rd aircraft carrier. The Chinese Air Force is also looking at mass production of its 5th generation J-20 stealth fighters. China is also aiming to modernize its rocket forces armed with latest missiles. China's biggest focus area remains future warfare, and a major chunk of the defense budget is expected to go to strategic support forces, which includes cyber warfare and information warfare. China had mobilized more than 60,000 troops for a military exercise and diverted them last year to the line of actual control. There's also increased Chinese Navy activity in the South and East China Sea and in the Indian Ocean region in general. The steady increase in Chinese defense budget is expected to result in more Chinese belligerence in the neighborhood, especially along the line of actual control.
They are into a huge capability building exercise, and this capability is being built keeping the objective of being totally dominating the South China Sea on their own terms, and the Indian Ocean region also to some extent.
China's rising defense budget is not just a cause for concern for democracies like India and Taiwan, but also for the United States of America. Chinese President Xi Jinping's dream is to make China the most powerful nation in the world by 2050. While China may have its eyes on the United States of America, the dragon is slowly creeping forward in Arunachal Pradesh and in Ladakh. India needs to catch up really quickly in terms of not just military modernization in border areas, but also development of infrastructure. With cameramen Ashok Bhanot and Abhishek Bhalla in Delhi, Gaurav Sawant
for India today.
Let me quickly cut across to Anant Krishnan for the latest on this big story. Anant, do we have details of the Chinese military budget? A lot of it, of course, remains shrouded in secrecy. But which are the key focus areas, key spending areas, and what would this mean for India, Anant?
Gaurav, I think shrouded is the right word because unlike many other militaries, there isn't really a very detailed item-wise breakdown about how the spending is actually done. But what I think we should note, Gaurav, is this. I think there is some symbolism in the official figure crossing the $200 billion mark for the first time. I think there's twofold messaging here, Gaurav. One is to people within China, which is generally in keeping with the message that Xi Jinping has been sending over the last 8 years, which is it's a strong China and it's their time right now, a message of nationalism. And I think that's something, there's some amount of signaling at home. But I think as your report also said, Gaurav, the signaling to India, I think to countries in China's neighborhood, to Taiwan, to Japan as well. So I think there's twofold signaling going on. As for the budget itself, Gaurav, I think we should keep in mind last year, the official figure was $179 billion. But most, I think, independent estimates from international experts put that figure at above 200 billion already, if you take into account a lot of other items that don't really figure in the Chinese defense budget. We should also note, Gaurav, there's a big Chinese military-industrial complex at home, which accounts for a lot of their capital outlay. That's also not accounted for entirely, unlike in India, of course, where we rely a lot on import acquisitions. So that's something for us to keep in mind as well. And as you said, Gaurav, it's a four-time difference, a four-fold difference. Of course, that reflects the economic size of China and India as well. But at the same time, it doesn't take away from the fact that it's a big concern for India, something we should really reflect on, especially because we're confronting a land border situation with China, while also longer-term concerns on naval military modernization. So it is a budget problem, a budget concern that India has to resolve going forward, Gaurav.
In fact, it's the future warfare, as you very rightly point out, Anant, which could be a cause for grave concern because militarily, India may have succeeded in getting China to withdraw from the north and south bank of Pangong Tso, and that is something perhaps that China will have to factor in before its next creeping forward movement. But Professor Brahmachalani, in your view, what is the key takeaway from China's military spending? Their R&D doesn't reflect here. Their pensions do not reflect here. So their budget may be a lot more. But what's your key takeaway, sir?
Defense spending is one of the most direct ways of measuring a country's potential military capability. But it's important for any country to translate that spending into real power. Just because a country is spending a lot on defense doesn't mean that that money gets translated into actual power on the ground. But there are two things we should bear in mind. First, that international estimates of China's defense spending are much higher than its official numbers because China is anything but transparent. It doesn't give it's not transparent on the distribution of the military spending. There is no itemized spending details that come with the budget finalization. But even if we go by the official figures, we should note one important thing, which is that in less than 15 years, China has gone from being one of the smaller defense spenders as compared to its peer rivals in Asia like Japan, to now spending more than Japan, Russia, India, and Australia together. Its latest budget, which has been unveiled today, is greater than the total defense spending of Japan, Russia, India, and Australia. That shows how rapidly China's defense spending has grown. And this has important implications for India because India's defense spending, far from actually growing, has actually contracted, at least in terms of as a percentage of GDP. Now, of course, as I mentioned, that higher defense spending does not automatically translate into greater military power. And for a country like India, the way to tackle China is not just to throw more money into military hardware, but to spend money wisely in a way that fortifies India's defenses and ensures that India has a deterrent capability to counter Chinese aggression and also to impose costs when aggression happens.
In terms of, that's a very important point you make. Impose costs on China. India's rapid infrastructure development, especially in the border areas. And we just heard Prime Minister Narendra Modi give out some of those indications, and he will be speaking to the Combined Commanders Conference tomorrow. But General, in your view, China spends much more than India in defense, and yet China pulled back. What message would China have taken from the north and the south bank of Pangong Tso when India did a QPQ? Was that in a way imposing costs, or was banning Chinese apps in a way imposing costs? How would you read the current situation in terms of India's response, and what should India's biggest takeaway from the Chinese budget be?
Thank you, Gaurav, for inviting me. Okay, I'll answer your question, but first let me say that, as we rightly pointed out, the Chinese budget is opaque in nature. There is total lack of transparency, and large amount of expenditure is not even accounted for. In some of these papers published elsewhere, a figure of about 25 to 30% additional markup has been given up as what actual Chinese budget is, because the conscripts are given only kind of pocket money. The pension budget is paid by local governments, not being paid by the central estimates. That's why the pensioners have a lot of crib, etc. The foreign purchases are not accounted for. Also, the R&D, which is about 20% of the budget, is not accounted for. So what is exact budget is not known. Also, when you compare with the United States, there is a PPP, the purchasing power parity. So you can't compare the United States budget with the Chinese budget. If you do it like that, the Chinese budget may come to $350 billion or something. Now, coming to the borders and preparing for against the Chinese, it's obvious that we have done great amount of work, learnt lessons in last 8-9 months. We have rebalanced. We've got offensive capabilities across the border in various areas, and we have in the course of this time that just passed, we have gained great amount of confidence that we can handle the Chinese on the borders. So there is a plus, and the Chinese would have also learned that it is not easy. We are not pushovers across on the line of actual control, either in Ladakh or elsewhere also. So that is a clarity that Chinese would have also taken. And then there would be also responses of offensive kinds which will come to India. The other part is modern warfare. As you rightly pointed out, the issues of cyberspace and electromagnetic spectrum and the space, which of course we have to work at. If they say there's some cyber attacks, 4,000 odd took place last year. People have spoken about SII being targeted. In the United States, there's a great inquiry going on SolarWinds, which had a major cyber attacks in last year, including government agencies. So there is something else happening. We have to be prepared for on a different spectrum altogether.
That's a very interesting point to make. And Anant, you've been in Beijing for a very long time. This strategic support arm of the Chinese armed forces, the cyber army, their information warfare or disinformation warfare, in your appreciation, how much ahead is China when it comes to this? Because recently we are told they attempted to target, according to the central government, and succeeded in targeting, according to the Maharashtra government, the power grid in Maharashtra, and attempts were made in Telangana, in Delhi, and even in Shillong.
You're right, Gaurav. I think every piece of literature that's come out from Beijing, from PLA-affiliated think tanks over the last 10 years, or even 15 years, has spoken about the need to fight a different kind of war, not the old school kind of war of attrition fought on the ground, but all the things that you just highlighted. And I think for India, it's very real in the sense that there's been lots of evidence, documentation coming out recently over the wave of cyber attacks that India faced last year. Though I think there is some amount of debate on what the cyber attacks actually caused. I think the Power Ministry in India has said there was no real impact because India had taken precautions. But at the same time, I think there's no question there is a threat. And I think, Gaurav, just stepping back a bit, looking at the Chinese experience, I think two things really stand out in terms of lessons that they have learned and implemented that perhaps are worth noting. The first, of course, is that a lot of this military spending, military strength projection comes from economic growth. Brahmacharli mentioned the huge change in the last 15 years. And of course, all of that is because of the fact that the economy has grown so far, which is how the military spending has grown. And the second thing, Gaurav, is the need for any big military power to have a big domestic military industrial complex, manufacturing at home. And I think India is putting that into place, as you mentioned at the start of this program. So I think those were two big, key takeaways. And I think it does seem to be that India is implementing those two as well. And India will have to implement those in the long run.
And the Prime Minister has been focusing on Atmanirbhar Bharat. Professor Brahmacharli, you spoke of imposing costs. In your appreciation, were the QPQ operations undertaken by the Indian Army in a way sending out that signal to China? When I interviewed Army Commander, Northern Command General Joshi, the indication was that India has options that India can exercise. And when it comes to cyber warfare, is defense the best strategy or is offense the best strategy? And do we have the capabilities of imposing those costs on China?
I think first one should bear in mind what China's strategy is. China's strategy since the 1980s has been to secure a military objective without military combat. So the territorial grabs that China has made since the 1980s have all been centered on bulletless aggressions. Even the territorial grabs that they made in Ladakh in April last year, those grabs were made by stealth, without any fighting. When there is fighting, they realize that their soldiers are anything but, a match for the opposing side. We saw that in the Galwan Valley, the bravery and the valor of Indian soldiers, that even after they were ambushed, they fought back and inflicted heavy costs on the Chinese. So the Chinese strategy has always been to avoid military combat, but to use military power to coerce the opponent, to overwhelm the opponent. That is, short of using military power, use your capabilities to achieve your military objectives. Now, India is a defensive country, and defense generally has the advantage over offense because it's easier to protect and hold than to advance, destroy, and seize. Many people cite the power asymmetry between India and China. They say that India's options are very limited. That's not true. Because if your objectives are primarily defense, you do not have to match your opponent's military capabilities. If you look at China and the bloody nose it got in 1979 when it invaded Vietnam,
yes,
a tiny little country gave a bloody nose to China, or how Vietnam defeated three big powers, France,
yes,
United States, and China in that order.
Yes.
So war is not decided by military and economic capabilities alone. If war were to be decided by economic and military capabilities, then the stronger side would always triumph. But history is replete with examples of the weaker side
and yet
winning over the stronger side. So what India needs to do,
and yet India was able to take effective countermeasures. And perhaps that is what, and that is exactly why I played out what Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, कि कोई भारत की ओर आंख उठाकर नहीं देख सकता. That's the valor of our forces on ground and the leadership. And General, in your view, has China got that message that it's creeping forward, taking Indian territory by stealth? That's not succeeding. And those who are saying that China was able to achieve the 1959 claim line, in your appreciation, one, is that true? Two, has India been able to push China back not just in one area, but that buffer zone also China moves back equal distance? Does that also indicate that we need to invest a lot more in modernizing and building up infrastructure in all our border areas from Arunachal Pradesh to Ladakh, sir?
Okay, interesting question that you have raised, Gaurav. The fact is that while we understand that there may be a force asymmetry in the favor of China, even in ground forces, all the air forces and the maritime, but it's the way you combat to denigrate the force asymmetry is the epitome of strength, and that's how we are planning to do so. So while there is a defensive layout, very well planned defensive layout, there are obviously plans to have offensives being carried out in whichever manner that we wish to do so. And one of the options tried out on 29th, 30th of August is just one more arrow in our quiver. We may have many arrows, and where can they be launched is our business, and which have been well planned. So the Chinese also would well understand that it is not a situation of a past time that we think can be pushed over, and also that maybe we were lulled into some complacency earlier by all that bonhomie which was developing over a period of time, last 20 odd years, that no bullet has been fired.
Yes.
I think we have also learned our lessons that there is no need to be complacent and to deny him any opportunity of taking any surreptitious occupations of some areas.
Oh, absolutely.
Hereafter it won't be so simple. Now we have to be prepared for what in future may happen. It could be on the border. It could be many other ways that he can employ. He has worked assiduously on his technological competence in many forms. So while making infrastructure of this kind, we also have to think about offensive and defensive measures in the other realms of warfare, as you've been mentioning, in the cyber realm, offensive also and defensive certainly, and also in matters of electromagnetic spectrum and information warfare. So the whole compact.
Keep imposing costs on China. That is something that needs to be done. Absolutely. Lulled into Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai in the 1950s, once again in Wuhan and Mamallapuram. But, Galwan was an absolute wake-up call. And Prime Minister saying, ab koi hamari taraf aankh utha kar nahi dekh sakta. Perhaps that 29th, 30th August QPQ was sending out one such message. But do we need to send more? Anant, you're in Beijing, and when what's the reaction in China if India were to sell the BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles to Philippines, for example, or this Quad summit that's going to happen? Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, just spoke that there's already been an interaction with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. There's been an interaction with the Japanese Prime Minister, and there will be one of the Quad summit. What message goes to China?
It's been interesting reading what's coming out of Beijing, Gaurav, from here in India, in terms of what's been said about the Quad. Recently, there's been a video doing the rounds of a PLA academic, a Major General, one of the universities, who was talking about the clash in Galwan Valley. And he makes the point towards the end, which something I think reflects what the Chinese strategic community is thinking, which is their biggest concern has always been India moving closer to the US, and now in terms of the Quad as well. So I think they acknowledge that they find themselves in this strange dilemma, self-inflicted dilemma, where they have been aggressive along the line of actual control. At the same time, they've been, by their own actions along the line of actual control, they're leading to a self-fulfilling situation where their broader strategic concerns are being fulfilled, where India is moving closer to these countries. Even if, Gaurav, we should keep in mind that even if what India is doing with the Quad has its own strong logic, perhaps there will be limited utility when it comes to defending our land borders with China. But I think it is a huge concern for Beijing. And the takeaway from what this PLA Major General said was that at all costs, they have to make sure that India, Japan, and Australia and the US do not come together. And they mentioned that in their comments, they see India and Japan as their biggest concerns. They feel Australia is the weakest link in the Quad, something that they're trying to exploit. So I think going forward, Gaurav, you will see them trying to do what they can to diffuse the threat that they see from the Quad. And make no mistake, I think it's something that seriously does concern them, which is why it's repeated so often in everything that you see coming out of Beijing.
Professor Brahmachalani, Quad summit. Now, when Donald Trump was the president, there was a lot of intelligence sharing. Is that mechanism government to government, or is it personality oriented, or do we see more of that in the times to come to checkmate China? Also, because now you have European powers that are patrolling the South China Sea. The UK is talking about sending their aircraft carrier with US destroyers accompanying them. France is saying so. Germany is saying so. What's the signal to China from the rest of the world, from democracies of the world?
there's a sea change in international attitudes toward China since last year. The pandemic was one factor, but Xi Jinping's expansionism was another important factor. And negative views of China have reached historic highs, according to a Pew Research Center survey. Having said that, one should not overplay the importance of the Quad. The Quad is not a military alliance, and the Quad's focus is primarily in the maritime domain, while India's threat vis-a-vis China comes in the Himalayan region. We saw that in the Doklam crisis, and we have seen that since last year, that when it comes to countering China's aggression, India is by itself. That will not change materially in the coming years, even if the Quad is institutionalized. But I think this Quad summit that is going to take place this month should not obscure another fact. The Quad, not publicly but privately, is centered on China, on putting discrete checks on the exercise of Chinese power. But the US President Joe Biden, he still doesn't have strategic clarity on China. He's still developing his China policy. This Quad summit should have taken place after Biden had developed his China policy. Without strategic clarity on China, the Quad is meaningless. So this meeting that will happen, this summit meeting, will be largely symbolic until and unless the Americans show clarity, show resolve. The Quad will not become a meaningful mechanism.
But General, what about intelligence sharing? Because being forewarned is being forearmed. It held India in good stead during Doklam. We are told it held India in good stead even during these past 8 months of standoff. And a lot of intelligence comes from some of these Western powers. So Quad's a good mechanism to move forward on. That's point one. Point two, your take on India and Philippines in terms of defense, the sale of hardware, BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles. What signal does it send out to China? What signal does it send out to other countries in this region?
Okay, thank you, Gaurav. I absolutely agree with what Professor Chalani was saying. While there is a great amount of optics available about a Quad, and the summit meeting will make a difference to how the Chinese react to it. But the fact of the matter is that on the continental side, on the territorial front, we have to do our business ourselves, and we have to prepare to do it in as best manner as possible. Now, answering your question about the intelligence, the fact is that we have signed those 4 treaties that we have with the United States, and we presume that after the BICA had been signed, there would be a good flow of intelligence available, especially of the areas of Xinjiang and of Tibet, and many other issues which are available to all the maritime domain awareness, which could be made available thanks to the United States and all the prowess it has got. So there is an advantage which will be accruing thanks to this new relationship which is developed in the course of last couple of years. So that is the intelligence part of it. And the second part of it is that the relationships that we are developing, of course, Quad makes a difference, like I mentioned, but there is a great amount of trade of the arms and missile variety which is taking place, which was stated last year also, that the exports are rising. Philippines, BrahMos is one thing. There is relationship developing with Vietnam, also existing previously. We have relationship going with Myanmar. So all those matter. It is a question of anxiety that can be caused to the adversary that is important. Any kind of tension that we can raise, any kind of hackles that we can raise to any adversary will be a good idea, and it adds on to our. Having said that, we still have to prepare to fight our own battles ourselves when the final.
Oh, absolutely! Nobody's going to fight our battles. Nobody's going to fight our battles, but the better prepared we are to defend our territorial integrity, lesser is the chance of a battle. But Anant, when India bans Chinese apps and hundreds of them, other countries follow suit. Does that send out a signal to China? is there an impression that they went too far, they need to pull back, or is this just a tactical retreat? They will come back with more vigor, more force, and a bigger offensive in perhaps the years to come?
A great question, Gaurav. I think it is a tactical retreat, and I don't think that their strategy vis-a-vis the LAC really may have changed. But I think it's a good question that you raised on the apps. The way I see it, if you look at the readouts from the February 25th phone call that External Affairs Minister Jaishankar had with his counterpart Wang Yi, it was very interesting that both sides, even though they reviewed the disengagement process, had very different takeaways on the current state of the relationship and the way forward. India's point was very clear, Gaurav, that unless there's complete disengagement and then de-escalation, which is a long way away, there's no way of complete normalcy in the relationship, which is trade and investment, economic relations. All of that is on hold until you reach that stage. But what the Chinese were saying was quite the opposite. Their grouse with India, and I think why they were so concerned by last year, is that what India is calling a whole-of-government approach. The fact that if the boundary is disturbed, every other part of the relationship is disturbed as well. I think that's something that has upset Beijing, which is why that was flagged by Wang Yi, who said, quote, there was backpedaling in India's China policy. So I think it does concern them, the idea that if we put the boundary front and center and make the case that there can't be trade with China, there can't be investments from Chinese companies, there can't be business as usual if this core aspect of the relationship is disturbed. I think India is making a point that the model that has governed the relationship since 1988, which is you compartmentalize issues, that no longer works. And I think that's a very important message.
Oh, absolutely.
I think it's an important message that has been signaled, and I think that's something received in Beijing as well, which is why I also think, Gaurav, I think normalcy is a long way away in the relationship because both sides at the moment have very different demands and expectations of what actually normalcy in this relationship means.
No, but Professor Chilani, isn't India right to say that China cannot keep creeping forward? They cannot take our territory and yet expect to gain economically from India. And apart from the government, do citizens play a very important role here? Every citizen, if we decide as much as possible, we don't buy anything that's made in China, as much as possible. Does that send out a signal to China? Even if we have to shell out a little more, buy something that's made elsewhere, strengthen relationships elsewhere and not with expansionist forces. Can that work, Professor Chilani, in your view?
Well, first on the economic side, if you look at the Indian response to China's aggression since April last year, India banned some Chinese apps. India also put on hold Chinese investment proposals. But India shied away from imposing meaningful economic and diplomatic sanctions on Beijing. India has shied away from punishing China for its aggression. Also, to answer the first part of your question, there has been a lack of consistency in India's stand over the decades under successive governments. In 1988, when Rajiv Gandhi went to China, he turned Indian policy upside down by agreeing to separate the border issue from the process of normalization. Until then, the normalization was conditioned on a resolution of the border issue. After all, the 1962 war was triggered by territorial disputes. And therefore, a resolution of the boundary dispute was considered to be essential by the Indian side. And that's the reason why Indira Gandhi in 1981 instituted border talks with China. But Rajiv Gandhi went to Beijing in 1988 and completely upended Indian policy. Look at what's happening since last year. Last year, we were talking about status quo ante, right? China being forced to roll back its territorial grabs. Today, the line is different. Yes. We are no longer talking about return to status quo ante. Now we're talking about a return to peace and tranquility along the border. A big climb down by India.
Okay.
Now, there's a big climb down by India.
Perhaps we need more clarity from the government on this aspect, because some of the officers have spoken to
emboldens Chinese aggression.
Oh, absolutely. And there the government has to follow one line. Peace and tranquility and status quo ante need to go hand in hand to ensure India's relationship with China moves forward. But will that actually remain the case? We'll track that story very closely. But as always, Anand Krishnan, Professor Brahmachalani and Jalal Sharma, many thanks for joining me here on India First for clarity on the Chinese budget and India's response.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kamal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.